Now prepare yourself for me speaking very fast, highly caffeinated, and I need to do loads of tests just before I actually pack this microphone back, because the eBay that I purchased the microphone from last week, I put through a request on Friday and I heard nothing back. And then before I knew it, he sent me a message today saying that the collection is happening today. So obviously the microphone is not packed up yet. It is now 11:44. And the collection can happen anytime between 9 and 4:30 apparently. So I do need to get this packed up to make sure that it's all ready to go when the collection happens. I haven't actually made my final decision on the microphone yet, which is unfortunate, but equally it's a lot of money in a way, and it's a microphone that I technically didn't need. And it was kind of a good opportunity to experience it a little bit, to hear the sound quality difference and understand the characters of each microphone. So the goal of this test really is just to see if I can mimic and take the qualities out of each microphone, because I prefer the low end and the smoothness of this microphone, but I prefer the detail and the brightness of this one. Out of the box, this does sound way too bright. And then in comparison to this microphone sounds way too low. But it's ironic that, because prior to using this microphone, I had no issues with this other than the fact that it was picking up my breathing a bit too much. Now, another unfortunate thing, I have a little bit of a cold, so my voice probably sounds a little bit more nasalier than normal. But nonetheless, we have to move forward with what we got, and I essentially got no time at all with this microphone. So here I am just blitzing for a few tests. So this test that I'm going to be doing is actually just for my benefit, just so that I can actually refer back to in the future. But I figured I'd put it out there on YouTube just in case any of you out there want to do these similar comparisons and get to understand the characters of each microphone. So there's nothing else left to it, and let's just get to it. So first off, down here, I've got the RE20 with the RE20% preset at 53 dB. I've bumped it up a little bit because I found that I keep having to boost my audio every single time I do recording. So the default on this preset is actually 51 dB, but I bumped it up by 2. No processing set at the moment. This is on the flat response. This is set to a dynamic microphone. I've set it at 6 dB less than this one because I actually measured roughly around a 5 dB difference, but then I watched a review and they actually mentioned it was actually 6 dB. So I'm actually going to go more technical and scientific on that and actually just reduce this RE27 by 6 dB. So this is currently set to the flat profile, which I would imagine it's sounding very sharp at the moment, which is a character I typically didn't like from the audio. So I'm now going to bump it up. I'm going to add the processing on. Now I've had the processing on, this has added a little bit of depth, sparkle, and punch. I'm going to go back out. Let's start with neutral actually. Let's go back and check the dynamic microphone. So now both microphones have the neutral preset set on the Rodecaster Pro 2. As before, flat profile. This is on flat response also. I'm now going to quickly change this to see what it sounds like on the high cut filter. Now I'm just going to see how this sounds like on this high cut filter. So I would imagine now on the high end, it's going to just bring that down a couple of dB. I believe on the technical specs, it actually cuts down on the far end around about 3 dB. So it doesn't sound as sharp, which obviously for me would be a good thing because that's the criticism I got with this microphone. I still feel that the RE20 has a lot more richness on the low end. Maybe I can bump this up a little bit on the higher end just to sort of make it sound a bit more similar to this in terms of the brightness. Moving on, I'm just going to bump this up to the Podcast Studio preset. Now the Podcast Studio preset, I'm not entirely sure what it's doing here. I would assume it's a bit more balanced. When I did my last audio test, the Broadcast Studio preset was actually very sort of boomy, and I do have a deep voice. So I did actually kind of like looked into the RE27 thinking that this microphone could balance off my voice a little bit. I don't exactly have like a Barry White deep voice, but my voice is relatively deep. So I did think that maybe the RE27 could actually complement that a little bit more. Whereas this does have a lot of rich low end, which actually allows for a nice smooth bass. So I feel there's a place for this microphone. So like if I wanted to sound a bit more, have a bit more authority in the voice, or like a movie trailer type of situation. Not that I'm not going to do any voiceover for that, but there is a place for that type of sound. Whereas I actually feel like the RE27 was actually probably representing my voice a little bit better, especially after adding the high cut filter on there, which actually adds the brightness, but then just lowers that sharpness a little bit. So let me go down to the broadcast to show you what I mean by that. So I'm now set on the broadcast preset with this currently still with a high cut enabled. I'm just going to boost it back up. So So now both microphones are on the flat response, and now this is going to sound slightly sharp again, and this is typically a sound that I don't like. And then between, if I was to compare the two microphones like this, I would then lean more towards the RE20 sounding like a better microphone because it just sounds so much more smoother, but a bit more on the darker side, but just definitely a lot smoother. Whereas this, definitely brighter, but just a bit too sharp. Now what I'm interested in, I'm actually going to enable the high cut filter on again, and then set this to maybe podcast studio, because I also feel like the proximity between how far I'm talking from the microphone actually changes massively. So yesterday when I did the test and I was really up against the microphone like this with the broadcast preset, I found it too boomy. And I'm going to see if I can brighten up this audio. So when I switch back and forth, does the audio change drastically or not? So on the RE20, I'm going to bring down the depth probably about halfway. I'm going to max out punch and sparkle. Do I have to go all the way? Yeah, let's go all the way. So again, I'm not like an audio engineer to know actually specifically how to EQ anything, but on the presets here, when you've got depth, sparkle, and punch, I feel like, as before, I felt like on the low end, the RE20 sounds great. It's got a rich, smooth low end, but I just feel like it just lacks a little bit on the top side. So if I was to just lower the depth on this microphone, but then maximize the sparkle and punch on this microphone, would it replicate this a little bit more? I've, in the sense that it's keeping the high end side of things on the audio, but then just smoothing out on the low side. Just to remind myself, on the channel 3, this is on the dynamic microphone. This is on the broadcast preset at the moment because I feel like at a normal speaking distance to the microphone, that little extra depth could actually be quite nice for my voice. Whereas when I was up against it like this, I found it a bit too much. But just to run the test, I can remind myself later on, if I also add this in neutral. So here's what the neutral preset sounds like on my voice as I'm talking right up against it. Despite this microphone is supposed to be having variable D technology, so then no matter where I move, it shouldn't actually change the tone of my voice, and it should actually sort of like mitigate the proximity effect a little bit. But I do find this microphone, you still have a proximity effect. It doesn't eliminate it completely, but it definitely does help it versus the Shure SM7B, which if you go right up against the Shure SM7B, it's really bassy. So now here's me talking at a more natural distance, which is probably about 3 to 4 fingers away distance from my face. On the neutral preset on the RE27 dynamic microphone 47 dB. Going back here, just looking at how these settings are done at the moment. So if I was to say on this microphone, I think naturally sounds a bit too bright, but not enough on the depth. So if I was to just to boost this a little bit, just to give this microphone just a little bit more depth, I'd actually love to go granular to see if I can actually perfect the sound and make sure that they sound perfectly identical, but I just don't have the time to do that, hence why I'm speaking extremely fast, because any minute now the DHL driver could be arriving to collect this microphone. So just going back onto the RE20, I'm just going to boost the depth up a little bit because this is a character that I do like about the RE20, that there is that smooth low end. Just to bring this back down on the sparkle side, just so I'm not overcooking it too much. And likewise with the punch. Don't actually know what the difference is between punch and sparkle. I would imagine sparkle being more on the far right side of the audio where it's the very top end of it. But equally, it's actually in the middle between the two. So that is quite sort of misleading to me. Well, it's not intuitive at least. So I'm kind of curious to see how this sounds at the moment. I might actually take down the depth actually, just a tiny bit more. Because as before, the goal of this test is to try and replicate this microphone to sound like this one. So now I'm really going to boost up the RE27's depth just to see if I can really play with the balance between the depth and the high end, because this is extremely high. If it's extremely high, then maybe if I can just raise the low end a little bit so they're a bit more balanced that way rather than bringing down the highs. As before, if you're following my journey and all of this, it's funny to think that I'm doing these tests, like getting all specific and granular with all the different settings and the different items of tech that I'm using, when in reality, the type of content that I'm using will actually benefit from just having a very standard, bog standard audio. I just love the toys and I love playing with all sorts of tech, from anything really, laptops, tablets, audio, visual. It's just all fun to me. So here we are. So going back to microphone 2 on the RE20, if I was to go back to the podcast studios, I think that's probably the more balanced preset for me. Neutral sounds a little bit too flat and broadcast sounds a bit too boomy. That's where you got, this is where the settings are at the moment. So I'm just going to boost up the sparkle, boost up the punch. So as before, if I'm happy with the low end on here, but I just need to boost up the high end, that's where I'm going to go with, but using the Podcast Studio preset as a template. Moving over to microphone 3. Let's start that again. So in the Podcast Studio. So this is where it's landed here, but I wanted to give it a bit more depth, a little less punch, a little less sparkle. So all in all, this microphone isn't as bad as I originally thought. I was just using it wrong. So definitely always using the microphone with a high cut filter enabled just over here. And then you have to EQ and play with it a little bit. And kind of like how when I was thinking about this, and because I don't exactly know how all this audio is coming out, I'm going to revert back down to the Podcast Studio preset just to have it a bit more balanced on that part. So they're both now set to the Podcast Studio preset. As you can see, I'm talking in, despite having a 6 dB difference in gain on the Rodecaster Pro 2. Depending on which way I'm facing, obviously, I'm looking towards the screen over here, which has the overhead monitor. That's why the RE27 starts boosting up a little bit, because I then start looking and talking to this direction. But if I'm talking directly across, they should actually be perfectly level. So just to recap my thoughts on the RE27, and that the microphone is actually much brighter than the RE20. And then depending on the use case scenario, your voice or what you're trying to achieve from it, this could be the better option for you. When I was doing a side-by-side comparison with it, I did actually feel this sounded a lot more clearer. And in comparison, this sounded muffled, which is not a word I ever used with this microphone. When I compared this to the Shure SM7B, the SM7B sounded muffled. This sounded crystal clear. But then now against this sounds clear and this sounds muffled, but this sounds smoother on the low end, whereas this one just didn't really have much. So when it comes to the microphones, it is definitely a use case scenario thing. It is definitely something based off your voice, what you're trying to achieve, and what kind of story you're trying to tell. Because if you are trying to be dramatic, you want that proximity effect, you want that low end. But if you're trying to actually have just spoken word, then you want something very detailed and clear. Equally, you don't want anything too sharp in your ears where there's going to be listening fatigue, which is kind of like how I originally felt about this microphone when I first set it up and unboxed it, is that it was just way too sharp. But then bringing it back down, it actually allowed to have a bit more clarity on the top end. Unfortunately, the DHL driver could be arriving any time between this morning and 4:30, so I do need to get this packed up and get it ready to be sent back. So that concludes my test for this video. Maybe at some point I'll look to purchase a brand new one, because again, I just didn't feel comfortable how this was been managed, because with the grill slightly off, it does feel like something's been messed around inside. That could have been a simple foam refurbishment from hopefully a professional, or it could have been a cowboy doing it, and I don't know what their quality of work is like, and I don't know what's going on inside. This could have been a completely faulty microphone and they repaired it. Who knows? But because I don't know, I lost confidence in it and I did actually request a refund. So for £360, it's not a terrible deal because it's essentially half price. And I did actually was contemplating keeping it, and I could just find the Allen key just to sort of correct the top and then just keep the microphone. I was a bit hasty. I've already put through the return request and they've already arranged a courier to come collect it today. So I best get this packed up and get it sent back. And then if I was to ever go down the road of actually looking into this microphone again, I'll probably just end up purchasing brand new. But at the same time, £700 on a single microphone is very hefty considering the amount I've paid and the amount of and the amount of money I've spent on microphones in general. So I've mostly just recorded this video for me, for my reference, but I put it out there just in case any of you have found this useful when you're doing your comparison between the two microphones.